Tony's the author of 15 books. One of them, his newest, featured here. If you don't have your copy, you're missing out. Tony was staff writer at the New Yorker magazine for more than 30 years and a visiting scholar at the New York University for 25 years. He's lectured around the world and is a consultant on planning and conservation issues. And one rainy afternoon, this was before I joined Heisted and H2H, he helped brainstorm the idea for H2H RCP. And this is a group he greatly admires. And we've had a lot of wonderful conversations leading up to his talk today to learn more about all of you. And so I will turn it over to Tony.
Well, thank you, Katie. It's such a thrill to be with you all. And do I need to share the screen, or is it already showing?
Need to share.
Then I will do so.
If not, I can pull up your slides.
If you give me 1 second, I
Yep.
think I can reach it. We had it earlier. Here it is. Sorry. Share. Is it showing up?
It's there. Yep. And just need to put into presenter or to play from the beginning. Yep.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you and to have a chance to talk both about my book and also about how I think it connects to the work that's so exciting that you guys are doing here in the H2H region. My book is about the overlooked crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the one that always gets the short end of the stick, although it's as urgent as any other. Just wrote a little essay called In the Shadow of a Shadow. Biodiversity crisis always seems to get overshadowed by the climate crisis, although it's intimately connected with it. And of course, the climate crisis gets overshadowed by everything else. The book is sort of written to try and be a primer to bring us all up to speed on this, and also about the wonderful work that's happening. It gives us a chance to say this is a crisis we can actually stave off. So 1 million species of plants and animals are at risk of extinction. This is the last male northern white rhinoceros on the day he succumbed with his beloved keeper at his side. Things have reached such a terrible point that we've already had to invent a new word, endling, meaning the very last of its kind. This is Lonesome George, who was the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, died at the age of 101. Trying to put an end to that. How did we get into such a fix? Well, we know here in North America that for a long time we had an idea about what needed to happen. An idea that in the 1870s was memorialized in this widely admired painting called Progress. Progress being that scantily clad, golden-haired lady floating over the countryside, trailing telegraph wires, railroads, as she moves west from the light into the darkness. Retreating before her are what has to go, the bears, the Native Americans, the buffalo, into the darkness. Meanwhile, here come the farmers and the ranchers and the miners. It's one way of looking at the landscape. And it's what happened to where I am, Manhattan, back in 1811 when it was carved up into lots. The idea being they took the hills, they chopped them down, they threw them into the streams, which the Dutch had called the kills. They made landfill, flattening everything, making a level field for development. So this is the Viely map of that, what happened in Manhattan. And what happened to the countryside at large was the so-called Jeffersonian grid, which imposed latitude and longitude on places that before that had found themselves by whether they had hills or valleys. Fortunately, more than a century ago, we began to develop another way of looking at the land. And one of the pioneers in that effort was the wonderful Benton Mackay, philosopher and forester, known as the father of the Appalachian Trail. The whole thing started for him the summer he graduated college in 1900. He and a friend bushwhacked their way up Stratton Mountain in southern Vermont. There were no trails then. Got to the top, shinnied up the highest trees they could find. Swaying there, Mackay said years later, he had this vision in his head that somehow he was part of a continuous place that reached from Maine all the way to Georgia along the top ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. A planetary feeling, he called it. And it wasn't just a trail, although the trail is an amazing construction, something that came into being almost entirely through volunteer efforts. A major work of conservation, a major work of development, entirely done by volunteers, and still to this day, managed for the most part by volunteers. But it wasn't just the idea of a pathway that intrigued him, it was the idea of the pathway as a unifying force in a larger landscape, what he called the Appalachian realm. And we're fortunate here in North America that this continent has good bones. It makes it easy to sort of feel at home with some of our major landforms. We've got the Appalachians in the east running north-south on the right of this map, which I had made for my book. It's paralleled by the Rockies in the west, and of course, similar vision occurred to Harvey Locke, Canadian conservation activist and lawyer, back in the early 90s when he was camping in the Canadian Rockies and thought, I'm part of a single landscape that extends all the way north from Yosemite to the Yukon. The Yukon always being a place that seemed magically wild. So that was the origin of the Yosemite to Yukon, Y2H, the first numeral letter organization. And now, of course, people think south of Yosemite down in Mexico, the whole Western Wildway. Then across the top of the continent is something even more extraordinary, the boreal forest, probably the most intact wilderness area anywhere left in the world, and the largest by far. It's 3,000 miles across. It's 1,200 miles north to south, 85% intact. And then down at the bottom, we got another only recently recognized large landscape, the North American coastal plain biodiversity hotspots. A lot of the first biodiversity hotspots were quite small in area. This one goes from Mexico all the way up to Long Island and beyond. So good bones, this landscape, this continent has good bones. And it's a good thing we did start thinking at that scale, because it was clear even in the late 80s that our traditional way of protecting places wasn't doing a good job of protecting critters because they didn't recognize the boundaries of these protected areas, and they wandered out in and out. And as development reached the edges of these areas, it then became impossible for them to wander back in. So our great landscapes were losing species. From this has come the idea that ideally we really need to protect something like half the land, half the water, in order to keep life alive. And the half Earth math worked out by Ed Wilson and many other people. Currently, we protect about 15%. of the planet, but that's only going to keep about a quarter or less of the species alive. Bump that up to half, to 50%, and we can hope to keep 85 to 90% of species alive. Not everything, it's a bittersweet formula, but close to everything. It's worth repeating. 50% gives us 90%. Please look for a moment into the steely gaze of Vladimir Vernadsky, an extraordinary biologist from the early 20th century who is revered amazingly both in the Ukraine and in Russia. Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences is Vernadsky Ukrainian Academy. And in Russia, subway stations are named after him, and even a crater on the dark side of the moon. And he also appears on currency in Ukraine. And it was his insight, he began to think, he sort of wrote the first biography of the biosphere. And he was the one who pointed out to us that it's incredibly ancient, something over 4 billion years old. It's incredibly enormous, seen from side to side around the surface of the globe. But it also has this third dimension, or almost this lack of a third dimension, namely its height. Most species live between the top of Everest and the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. Now that's a distance of only 12.5 miles. As someone has said, if you laid it out flat on the ground, you could drive across it in 20 minutes easy. So here we have this contradictory, this is the home place for all of living beings anywhere in the universe, at least as far as we know at this point. And it's ancient, and it's resilient, and it's incredibly rich and abundant, but it is by its very setup vulnerable. We are all part of something that is by its very setup vulnerable. And it was Vernadsky who first began showing us that the home we share, that all living beings share, has this contradictory nature. Now, of course, we're learning so rapidly about how extraordinary where we are is. All kinds of new discoveries, of course, the wood wide web showing that trees in a forest are connected by fungus and actually in touch with each other and can send nutrients to each other, from a mother tree to daughter trees. The idea that so much of what keeps life alive is in this, what's now called critical zone, from the top canopy of a tree down below ground into aquifers. Even newer idea that bees can think and feel, these tiny little things, that spiders can dream, quivering their legs as they dream. And as some commentator has said, we've got to get used to the idea that we live within a vast sea of sentience. Awareness is all around us, in all the life forms around us. So what does this boil down to in practical terms? It means there is no such thing as vacant land. There are no empty acres. They may, to our way of common thinking, be empty, but they are full of life. They are not vacant. And if we need them for other purposes, we have to respect the fact that we are displacing life. So what we're called on to do is learn how to begin to work as all species designers, where our needs and uses are respected, and so are the needs and uses of the existing occupants. It's a stretch, but it's got to happen. So within this half-Earth rubric, there seem to be 3 R's. Retain what's still wild, restore what was once wilder, reconnect the places where life is concentrated. in some ways, this is an easy task up in the boreal forest, for instance. The Canadians, although historically they behaved disgracefully to their indigenous inhabitants, known as the First Nations, never evicted them from the landscape the way we did down here. And so now they're turning to them and asking them to become the stewards and protectors of an entirely new system of national parks, the indigenous protected areas. Huge landscapes, 10 times the size, some of them, of Yellowstone National Park. And the indigenous people are stepping up and becoming, as they say, the moccasins on the ground instead of the boots on the ground. And this network of indigenous protected areas coming into being so rapidly is actually going to help Canada meet its 30 by 30 goal. And within the wilder places, we're already doing a pretty good job, at least of getting started on reconnecting the parks that have been severed. The whole reconnecting across highways movement with culverts and bridges, which started in Banff National Park, is now spreading down here into the States. It's a mighty big task to retrofit the entire interstate highway system, but that's another thing that's on the agenda. The mop-up work for what we didn't think about when we built them in the first place. And then in addition to the great large landscapes, there's the great large urbanizing areas coming into being, the so-called mega regions, of which H2H is such an important and prominent part. So, H2H, on a rainy and increasingly chilly afternoon and cloudy afternoon some years ago, Bill Lapik and I got into a car in Redding, Connecticut, Ridgefield, Connecticut, started driving west, crossed the state line, armed only with a very rudimentary resilient landscape map. Mark Anderson's work was then in its early days. It was when they still had forums and workshops to tell people, how do you tell a resilient landscape? Well, it's like the difference between an English muffin and a slice of bread. It's full of nooks and crannies that can hang on to species so they don't have to move away as climate changes. And we crossed the state line, and wait a moment, nothing happened. The landscape stayed the same. Suddenly we realized that this boundary, cobbled together by horse trading colonials in 1683, may have had some practical purposes in terms of organizing townships and what have you, but it had nothing to do with describing the actual landscape. So later that day, we got to walk through the Zoffness Family Preserve in Pound Ridge, which is nothing but nooks and crannies. That was the ground truthing we did at the start. We then met with people from the Westchester Land Trust, who thankfully gave us hot cocoa because I, at least, was chilled to the bone at that point. But here we had proved a point that the blobs were better descriptors than the maps we all grew up with and had never questioned. So that made me think it was time to reassess Saint Botolph, who is the patron saint of boundaries. And his name is perhaps not quite as weird as it sounds, because Botolph's town contraction becomes Boston. So his name is better known than you might think. So maybe boundaries have usefulnesses in some areas and less use in other areas. And from that has grown this amazing H2H landscape. And what a remarkable task you guys have set for yourselves. I'm so in awe of what you're trying to do and getting done. Here is this landscape that you might think of as just the landscape north of New York, but it's a landscape that's anchored by 3 world-class landscapes. You've got New York City down at the bottom, but you've got the Hudson River, one of the most extraordinary rivers and one of the most renowned rivers in the world. You've got the Appalachians running through as the Hudson Highlands through the northern end. And of course, you've got this amazingly vigorous Housatonic Valley work on the east end. So thinking of this area as a place is brand new, and thinking of this area as something that unites Connecticut and New York is brand new. It's also an area that's got some of the most well-to-do people anywhere in the world and some of the least well-to-do people anywhere in the world. And at almost 1.5 million acres in size, it is 3/4 the size of Yellowstone National Park. And with a population of 2.3 million people, that's the size of Houston, Texas, which is the 4th largest city in the US. So reaching out and reaching across this landscape, as someone just said in one of the earlier sessions, all the expertise you could possibly hope for anywhere is here. It's just a matter of linking it together. Connectedness, we found even on that first day when Bill and I were driving around, connectedness makes for acceleration. Not only connecting people together, but connecting how to connect people to the land. So of course, we've still got St. Botolph with us. We still often build as if there is no living structure before we get there. We've got these on the right, something I just stole from a piece in the Washington Post early this week. It shows an area outside of DC, but it could show an area in H2H. We find a patch of unspoiled land, we wipe it clean, we move in. 20th century practices that we have yet to not repudiate, but transform into something that respects both what's has been there and what's can be there. And of course, we need also to think better about the way we build these new places so that the people in them stay connected instead of divorced from each other. And at the same time, we all want things delivered to our doorstep, but the only way we can get that done so far is to womp the land. Here's Amazon super warehouse under construction in Hawthorne, New York, right near beautiful protected land in the Rockefeller State Preserve. This was a 10-acre site that had been a nursery, and now it will have 300,000 square feet of space and parking for 500 delivery vans. So I don't need to tell you, because we've just reminded each other of this, how the 3 R's, retain, restore, and reconnect, are barreling ahead here in the H2H area. The wonderful work being done by Follow the Forest. And I can see the images I have are already outdated based on the images we were looking at in the lightning round. Thinking in the more urbanized area about the wonderful work the Green Corridor is doing to connect up what's still open land in down near the Sound, in the towns down near the Sound. And then, of course, the pollinator pathway, which, as Louise was telling us, is now gone national and international. Extraordinary success. How to cope with growth, she said. The towns, based on Douglas Tallamy's amazing map of the lawns along the East Coast, the 2 million acres, and how if only half of that became pollinator pathways and rewilded landscapes, we would have an extraordinary amount of protected land. But there's, what is it, Louise, 50 million acres nationwide of lawns waiting to be reclaimed. Thank you. So then we'd have a 25 million acres. Again, 10 to 12 times the size of Yellowstone. And you're also reaching out to reconnect people up in the, so moved to look and see that, and Putnam County, there's now a monument honoring Daniel Ninham, leader of the Wappinger Indians, who fought on the side of the American patriots in the war, was killed in the Revolutionary War, fighting on our side, even though some Sharpies up in Putnam County had stolen 2/3 of the county away from his people, saying that they no longer had ownership rights to it. He nevertheless weighed in on our side. So we have to respect those who were once here, people I never heard of when I was growing up and learning the history of this area. And we have to think about the people who are in most trouble here in this area. Here's a map from a new article that's just come out, partly written by a Wildlands to Woodlands intern and partly by a professor at Amherst, amalgamating in one place those areas that are least served in terms of protected open space and have the most people of color and the least and the lowest incomes. And of course, these areas that pop out the largest are in Bridgeport, right next to Fairfield, right next to the wonderful work the Green Corridor is doing. That has to now become part of the program as well. So where are we now? We're at the end of this COVID restricted kind of partnership. It has often felt like only reaching out to each other through two tin cans. The partnership meetings strategy as originally proposed for H2H was at least 3 in-person meetings a year. We're still not quite ready for that, and we're coming up with as many alternatives as possible. In terms of leadership, we need to get away from white bread because we've got to accept the steering committee you now have is exemplary, marvelous people, but I think it needs to be enlarged to include diversity, which is lacking. Because if we don't do that, the future is toast. No other future is available. Furthermore, we now can start thinking about some funding that will come this way or can come this way. The president's signature of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been told it's a climate control act, it's a climate change act, but it does recognize nature as one element for trying to mitigate climate change. So there is a huge amount of money available suddenly for nature, even though this is not the Build Back Better bill we hope to get passed in the first place. One area that seems to be in line for substantial funding is the Connecticut River Valley, just east of the H2H, through the Conte National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. But it's a chance for the other watersheds in the region to start thinking about getting funding. It also looks like funding will be available for the Appalachians, both the northern part and the entire range. And I think it's not speaking out of turn to say that the Nature Conservancy is about to proclaim and promulgate the idea that the Appalachians are one of 4 landscapes around the world that are the topmost elements of their focus on what they want to accomplish moving forward. It's a thrill to be with you. I look forward to conversing with you, and I wanted to make sure, I hope you'll all have a chance to read my book, because I think, well, I've written 15 books, but this is by far the best. And I think it's a way of getting up to speed about the whole biodiversity element